Chapter 3. The Mind of Man's Earliest Earthly Ancestor. The fundamental doctrine of all forms of the theory of evolution applied to biology is that all living creatures, man included, descended from a common ancestry. Science has demonstrated this to be true by tracing the ancestry of man back through numerous gradients to the very lowest form's mind of man's earliest ancestor, 259 of organic life. A corollary of this is that the faculties of man constitute the sum of all his ancestral faculties and instincts that have remained useful or advantageous in the struggle for life. In other words, all that there is inherent in man is what he has inherited from his ancestry, near and remote. It follows that the potentialities of manhood resided in the lowest sentient being, in the monoran. This is, in brief, the doctrine of heredity held and insisted upon by all evolutionists, from Darwin down, who have discarded the doctrine of special creations. And it was because science has been able practically to demonstrate this doctrine to be true that the dogma of special creations of genera and species has been yielded even by those who do not admit that God has thereby been eliminated from the universe. If science has demonstrated anything more clearly than another within the purview of biological research, it is that the faculties of man were inherited from his lower ancestry, and hence those faculties resided, potentially, in the lowest unicellular organism. Scientists may differ in regard to minor details relating to the specific processes by which the physical organisms of genera and species have been evolved. But the doctrine of heredity is common to all forms of the theory of evolution applied to biology. We are enabled, therefore, to start our argument with a proposition that will not be disputed by any scientific evolutionist. The mental faculties of man are inherited from his lower ancestors, beginning with the lowest unicellular organism. This general proposition cannot be successfully controverted, and no evolutionist will make the attempt. It involves another proposition, however, which, as before remarked, is its corollary, namely, that the faculties of manhood exist potentially in the lowest form of animal life, to wit, the monoran. If the first proposition is true, the second is logically self-evident. But, lest someone might be inclined to doubt the soundness of the latter proposition, we will reduce it to the form of a syllogism. Thus, 1. An inherited faculty presupposes the existence of that faculty, actually or potentially, in the ancestry, near and remote, from which the inheritance was derived. 2. Man inherited his faculties from his lower ancestry, beginning with the lowest form of animal life. Therefore, the faculties of manhood resided potentially in the lowest form of animal life. We now have an undisputed and indisputable proposition to start with, and one upon which I shall hereinafter strongly insist. It must be remembered, however, that I have not, thus far in this chapter, stated any new propositions. I am merely trying to reduce to logical form and consistency the fundamental truths which evolutionists have discovered, and by which they have relegated the doctrine of special creations to the realm of superstition. These truths were, however, supposed to be atheistic by those who first applied them, but I shall endeavor to show that, when carried to their legitimate conclusion, they are the stronghold of scientific theism. The reader will now recall the fact that, in Part 1 of this book, I have endeavored to strengthen the proposition that the potentialities of the highest order of manhood reside in the lower organisms. I did so by showing that all the instincts of the lower animals are essentially altruistic, save the one instinct of self-preservation. All the others, beginning with the instinct of reproduction, pertain to future generations, first, to the perpetuation of the species by reproduction, and secondly, to the care and preservation of the young. I trace the development of the altruistic instincts and impulses to the higher civilization of man, showing that they are infinitely stronger than the purely self-regarding instinct of self-preservation. I pointed out the fact that the altruistic instinct lies at the bottom of all progressive development, physical, mental, moral, and religious, and that in that sense it might be termed the evolutionary instinct, the constant, effective energy, inherent in every sentient creature that makes for physical, mental, and moral progress, for the higher civilization, for universal altruism. I have thus endeavored to strengthen the final view of Huxley that the struggle for existence within the organism lies at the bottom of all progressive physical development and of all structural changes of physiological organism, by showing that it is equally potent in mental, social, moral, and religious evolution. and I have thus endeavored to strengthen the proposition of the atheistic philosophers that the potentials of manhood reside in the monoran, by showing that the first reproductive act of that organism without organs was essentially altruistic and progressive, and that the instinctive emotion that prompted the act, together with its concomitant altruistic emotions, the love of offspring and care for the young and helpless, as manifested in all those actions and enterprises that redound to the benefit of future generations, now constitute the prepotent agency of human progress. And the intelligent reader will not fail to note that, in thus reclassifying the human instincts and emotions by grouping all the instincts and impulses that pertain to the well-being of future generations into one class, which I have designated as altruistic, thus leaving the purely self-regarding instinct of self-preservation in a subordinate or subsidiary class by itself. I have suggested a law of evolutionary development, the executive energy of which inheres in that prepotent group of altruistic emotions and impulses. But that of itself is not the most significant part of it. Its real significance consists in the fact that the same instincts and faculties that cause the progressive development of animal life and structural organism also serve as the prepotent energy that causes the progressive development of mankind toward the higher civilization on lines leading to the ultimate goal of universal altruism. Nor is this all, for, if this hypothesis is the true one, it follows that evolutionary progress, physical, mental, moral, and religious, follows the lines of least resistance in nature. In other words, the natural tendency of all the instincts, except that of self-preservation, is altruistic, that is, other-regarding, and the only task imposed upon mankind is that of regulating those instincts, including that of self-preservation, and directing their energies into normal channels. This is a far different task from that imposed by the old philosophies which regarded all the natural impulses of man as evil and only evil, which regarded the so-called animal propensities as something to be fought and annihilated. Instead of regulated, restrained, purified, elevated, and legitimated, it gives to man a far different status in the moral universe from that assumed by the egoistic philosophy of Mr. Herbert Spencer, which assumes that all human acts are prompted by selfishness, and that those of the purest altruism are but selfishness in a slightly less offensive form, but still selfish. In short, the old philosophies imposed upon man the task of laboring upon the lines of greatest resistance in nature whenever he sought to elevate himself or benefit mankind. Whereas the hypothesis that I have ventured to advance presupposes that good and only good was implanted in the primordial germ, and hence I have ventured to assent to and emphasize the doctrine of the atheistic evolutionists, that the potentials of manhood, the loftiest manhood, are resident in the lowest form of animal life. It will now be in order to inquire what evidence is to be found in the mental phenomena of the lower orders of animal life to justify such a stupendous and far-reaching generalization. To that end we will, partly by way of recapitulation, group those phenomena which are demonstrative of the possession, by the lower animals, of faculties and powers, some of which, by development alone, may reach the highest possible grades of human intelligence. Let us begin with the intelligence possessed by the lowest unicellular organism. That intelligence is designated by the name of instinct, and by most of the atheistic philosophers it is thus dismissed as possessing no special significance beyond the fact that it is a curious phenomenon common to the lower organisms. Their object, in fact, seems to be to avoid the obvious significance of the phenomena, and hence they dismiss it by a resort to the usual petitio principii. This, as I have already pointed out, is the invariable method of atheistic reasoning whenever its votaries are confronted with a phenomenon that clearly points to a theistic conclusion. Hence they have resorted to the use of such words and phrases as irritability and reflex action to account for the obvious intelligence of the lower organisms. Thus, Mr. Herbert Spencer classes all reflex action as instinct, and then, presumably, in order to show that it is a poor rule that will not work both ways, he coolly informs us that all instinct is reflex action. To do him entire justice, however, it must be stated that he does not confine himself to this formula, for when he comes across a particularly hard nut to crack, that is to say, when he comes to an instinctive action that obviously is not a reflex action, he ably gathers it in under the term compound reflex action. I will not undertake the superfluous task of refuting a proposition so obviously unsound, for Romanes has ably performed that task in his Mental Evolution in Animals, to which the reader is referred. I will only pause to remark that Mr. Spencer's philosophy of instinct justifies the well-worn definition of metaphysics, namely, metaphysics consists in the invention of terms that have no meaning and then explaining things by those terms. As Romanes has clearly shown, though perhaps in milder and more roundabout phraseology than I am able to employ, the terms reflex action and compound reflex action are absolutely meaningless when applied to the great bulk of instincts with which animals and human beings are endowed. But what is instinct? This question can be answered intelligently only by confining ourselves to facts and phenomena, and divesting ourselves of the prejudices engendered by the use of those so-called scientific terms by which the whole subject has been so ably obscured. Especially do we need to divest ourselves of the impressions engendered by the use of terms that in themselves imply a theory of causation, such as reflex action, whether simple or compound, irritability, inspiration, special providence, special creation, and spontaneous generation. In other words, let us examine the facts of instinct, and then see if we can find a definition that will fit the facts. When that is done, we may look for a theory of causation that will fit the facts, not before. That is to say, let us treat the question by the inductive method, reasoning from facts to the general law underlying them, and not by first formulating a disputable postulate and then distorting the facts to fit the assumed theory of causation. Now, what are the facts, the primordial facts of instinct? I begin with the lowest animal organism, for it is at the very threshold of the organic world that we must find, if anywhere, the facts that will reveal the origin of life. Again, we will accept the facts from atheistic sources. If the reader will now re-examine the chapter in Part 1, in which the psychic life of microorganisms is discussed, he will more fully appreciate the point we are about to examine. In the meantime, it will be sufficient to mention the salient features of what we have previously learned. Haeckel tells us that the monoran, that wonderful organism without organs, that stands upon the very threshold of the organic world, is endowed with the faculty of sensation. That is to say, it is capable of feeling, for it reacts to stimuli. It shrinks from contact with that which will injure it. In other words, it not only has sensation, but it is endowed with the instinct of self-preservation, and instantly adopts the only means of self-protection within its power. It adapts means to ends, and this, according to Romanes and Binet, is indubitable evidence of intelligence. Haeckel also tells us that the monoran seeks and obtains nourishment, and, having found it, it performs the functions of digestion and assimilation. It can be fed artificially, and the process of digestion can be plainly seen under the microscope. The food, when colored for that purpose, can be seen to enter the body indifferently at any and all points, and to move from one part of the body to another, irregularly driven about in all directions, thus demonstrating at once the total absence of physical organism and the power which is resident in its mind to sustain life by adapting means to that end. Moreover, Binet tells us that unicellular organisms exercise the power of choice between that which is nutritious and that which is inert or deleterious, all of which constitute further proofs of intelligence, further demonstrations of the existence of a mind organism. Again, Haeckel informs us that his monoran is endowed with powers of locomotion. That is to say, it can move from place to place by means of improvised limbs, pseudopodia, which it projects at will from any part of the body point when it is by means of these improvised limbs that it moves about in search of nourishment. And Professor Gates has demonstrated that it has a memory of the direction in which food may be obtained, and that it can be educated to return to the place where it has once found food to its liking. This, as Ribot has clearly shown, is indubitable proof of consciousness. Lastly, Professor Haeckel tells us that the monoran reproduces itself asexually, that is, by fission or segmentation. The particular species which we have been considering, namely, the protamoeba, after it has attained a certain size, simply separates into two pieces. Thus, in the simplest possible way, two new individuals proceed by self-division from one quite simple individual, and thus was performed the first act of primordial altruism. Thus was taken the first step in the process of organic evolution, the first advance in the phylogenetic series that culminated in man. Thus were exhibited for the first time in the organic history of the earth all the phenomena of life, of sensation, movement, nutrition, reproduction, and intelligence, the promise and potentialities of a human soul. These are the facts, these the phenomena, relating to the instincts of the primordial germ. Now, let us for the moment ignore all the set phrase of speech with which theorists have befogged the question, especially all those words and phrases which imply preconceived theories of causation. Looking the simple fact squarely in the face, then, what do we find? First, a bit of protoplasma that is alive. It is a living, moving entity. It is an animate creature, and hence is endowed with a mind, for having a mind is the distinction between the animate and the inanimate in all nature. Secondly, we have found a sentient creature that does things, and voluntary action is a crucial distinction between the animate and the inanimate. Thirdly, we have found an animate, sentient creature that knows something. We know that it knows something because it does something, and the only criterion by which we can judge of what or how much it knows is by observation of what it does. If therefore we find that this creature invariably does what reason would approve, we must conclude that its intelligence, limited though it may be, is of a very superior quality. Fourthly, we find that this creature invariably does that which reason would approve. Thus, 1. It never rushes into danger, but avoids it if possible. Reaction to sensory stimuli. 2. It does not lie inert, but moves about in search of food by means of improvised limbs. Spontaneous movement. 3. Having found food, it does not reject it, but absorbs it, rejecting only that which is deleterious. What it has absorbed it digests and assimilates. Nutrition. 4. Finally, having attained maturity, it no longer confines its energies to purely selfish acts, but it reproduces itself, and thus provides for the perpetuation of its species, provides for future generations, for evolutionary progress. Reproduction. In short, the monoran exercises all the primary functions and produces all the primary phenomena of organic life: sensation, movement, nutrition, and reproduction. And it does so in a way that presupposes intelligence, for it adapts means to ends and exercises the power of choice, which, as we have already learned from Binet, Romanes, Gates, Ribot, and others, is the crucial test of intelligence. Now, to reduce what we have learned from the actions of the monoran to its lowest terms, we must conclude: 1. That the precision with which the monoran performs its functions, and the invariably beneficent results which follow, are demonstrative that its acts are in accordance with a law, and that that law is the primary law of organic life. 2. That the intelligence with which the monoran is endowed consists of a knowledge of the primary law of organic life. I have shown in previous chapters that instinct and intuition are identical, differing only in degree and subject matter, and that they both have to do exclusively with general laws or first principles. The conclusion, therefore, that the monoran is endowed with a knowledge of the primary laws of organic life not only accords with what we know of instinct or intuition in general, but it is in strict accordance with the observable phenomena in the life of the monoran. We are prepared, therefore, to define instinct, as we find it existing in the lowest form of animal life, as the power of immediate perception or apprehension of the essential laws of its being. This power being antecedent to and independent of reason, instruction, or experience. Now, whatsoever may be one's theory of causation, or his hypothesis as to the origin of life, whether it be spontaneous generation or special creation, it cannot be denied that the facts of the organic history of the monoran justify this definition of its instincts. This conclusion cannot be evaded without plunging into the realms of the supernatural and setting up the hypothesis of perpetual miracle. That is to say, the monera are obviously impelled to action by an intelligent energy or force, and this intelligence is either resident within the organism or it is an extraneous force. As the latter would imply a perpetual miracle, science is driven to accept the other hypothesis in order to keep within the domain of natural law. Even Mr. Herbert Spencer's doctrine of reflex action does not militate against the theory of an intelligent energy within, for in its simplest form, that of reaction to peripheral stimuli. Reflex action presupposes a subjective intelligence within the organism, an intelligence that is endowed with the instinct of self-preservation. In other words, reaction to stimuli is neither more nor less than shrinking from danger, an act which is necessarily prompted by an intelligence which apprehends or perceives an imminent danger. An intelligence which instantly adapts means to ends by adopting the only course by which it can avert the threatened injury, namely, by moving itself away from the danger point. If the act were not prompted by intelligence, it would be just as apt to move toward the danger point as from it. In this regard, the action of the monoran differs in no respect from that of the most highly organized human being. The latter, however, employs a nervous organism, the afferent nerves conveying the impulse to a nerve center, whence it is reflected back as an efferent impulse, independently of the volition of the objective mind. It is at this point that the old psychology fails to account correctly for reflex action. Knowing nothing of the subjective mind, as distinguished from the mind of which the brain is the organ, and realizing that the efferent impulse is independent of volition, that is, the volition of the objective mind, the inference was that, somehow, reflex action is not prompted by intelligence. Whereas, in point of fact, it is prompted by the highest intelligence that man possesses, namely, that of the subjective mind, the mind of instinct or intuition, the mind that is ever alert for the preservation of the body. Reflex action, therefore, as manifested in reaction to a peripheral stimulus, as when a limb is pricked by a sharp instrument, is the simplest phenomenal manifestation of the instinct of self-preservation. It is manifested alike in the monoran and in man, for it is prompted by the same subjective intelligence. There is this difference, however. In the monoran, the act is performed independently of physical organs, which is another demonstrative proof that the subjective mind antedated physical organism. Having shown that the phenomena due to sensation in the monoran are prompted by intelligence, we need not produce arguments to show that all its other functions are prompted by the same intelligence. For two of the other three functions are manifestations of the same instinct, namely, that of self-preservation. That is to say, three of the four classes of the phenomena of organic life, as manifested in the primordial germ, namely, those of sensation, movement, and nutrition, are all due to that instinct. The phenomenon of reproduction, on the other hand, is due to a totally different instinct, as I have hereinbefore pointed out. I have ventured to designate it as the evolutionary instinct or the altruistic instinct. It is entitled to the first designation because it constitutes that powerful, creative energy that lies at the bottom of all progressive physical development of animal life. It is entitled to the second designation because it prompts to acts that pertain exclusively to future generations, and is therefore the basis of all the altruistic emotions. And this is why I have felt compelled to define instinct, as we find it manifested in the lowest form of animal life, in the general terms I have employed. That is to say, the instinct of the monoran is not merely the instinct of self-preservation, although it includes that instinct, but it also includes that which is in a sense the exact opposite. In a word, it includes that energy that lies at the bottom of all evolutionary development, physical, mental, moral, and spiritual. It is upon this hypothesis alone that evolutionists can logically predicate the doctrine of the descent of man from the monoran. It is upon these facts alone that they can logically assume that the potentials of manhood are resident in the monoran. The instincts of the monoran cannot therefore be adequately defined in terms that will not apply to the highest intuitions of man, for if man is descended from the monoran, it follows that his highest intuitions are the result of the development of identical faculties existing in coed in that ancestor. Moreover, the instincts of the monoran cannot be adequately defined or described except in terms that are also definitive of omniscience. We find, therefore, in the lowest unicellular organism known to science, psychical faculties that by development become the highest mental attributes of man, and by extension to infinity, the highest conceivable attributes of an omniscient deity.